On this episode of China Unscripted, we lay out the CCP's playbook for taking over another country, and a lot of it's going to sound very familiar. Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Gnesta.
And joining us once again is Cleo Paskal, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. All right, welcome back, Cleo, for I think the 11th time.
Has it been the 11th time? Yeah.
We should have a prize or an award. Well, the award is for the audience who gets to see you over 10 times.
That's very kind of you. I think the award is definitely mine for getting to spend time with you here in our little bunker in Quebec. Although I'm in one part of it and you're in the other, and here we are together again.
No, the award is ours to be with you.
Don't get into a gratitude spiral with a Canadian. This will not end well.
Shouldn't you just accept defeat and apologize?
She's not French.
That's true. Although I do remember you told us once about the war plans the U.S. and Canada had against each other, which I thought was fascinating and will come true.
Yes, and we've spent the last 100 years lulling you into a sense of confident superiority so that we can strike you again when you're least expecting it.
I will not forget that you burned down the White House in the War of 1812.
Thank you, Matt. It needed to be said.
The century of humiliation.
That's right.
Never forget.
It also needed to be repainted, so we just did you a favor.
Yeah, I was looking a little pink at the time. Country can't have a pink house. I don't know where we're going with
All right,
this.
so we have an actual serious podcast to do. We can't talk about Canada. We can't talk about musicals this time.
No, we could.
We
Well,
could.
we're going to be talking about the South Pacific later, so that's perfect. But we won't start there. So, starting the actual portion of the podcast, a lot of people have been freaking out about the idea of illegal Chinese immigrants coming into the U.S. Now, most people tend to focus on crossing the U.S. southern border. But according to you, there's another big loophole of where they're coming in.
Yes, so I don't know how many are aware, but the U.S. does share a border with Japan. So if you look way out to the west, past Hawaii, so you're actually crossing the date line and technically getting to the east. This was a conversation, I think, a debate we've had before, whether Guam is the easternmost or the westernmost part of the U.S.
Easternmost.
Okay, there
Westernmost.
You want to take this outside?
We're in a bunker. We can't get outside easily. Go on, Cleo.
Yeah. So you go to Guam, and then where there is some very critical pieces of U.S. Military installations. Obviously it's the U.S. It's been part of the U.S. Since the end of the Spanish-American War, but it's not the only part of the U.S. that's out there. North of Guam, contiguous waters north of Guam, you have the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, and it's a string of islands. And it includes the islands of Saipan and Tinian, and they are also part of the U.S. They were part of the Japanese mandate between the wars, which included the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas and what is now Palau, Marshall Islands, and Federated States of Micronesia. And after the war, they became part of this strategic trust territories that was given by the UN to the U.S. to administer, and there's a whole other story around that, including how the U.S. nuked the Marshall Islands 67 times, which may be worth discussing. But all that area, after that trust territories period, decided which direction they were going to go in. And the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, their people decided to join the U.S. And they are Americans, part of the United States. There are about 40,000 people living in the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas. And they have unique laws around certain things. And one of them is immigration, which is how they set up initially the garment factories and things like that. But currently, they have visa-free access for Chinese. So if you're a Chinese tourist and you want to go visit Saipan, where there used to be a huge Chinese casino industry. The Chinese-linked casino in Saipan was running more money than the casinos of Macau, which was incredibly concerning. And there are still casinos, including a new one that's opened up in Tinian, where the U.S. is putting in $400 million worth of infrastructure for the Air Force. You can just get on a plane and get off in Saipan. And there are, as of the end of April, direct flights from Hong Kong to Saipan again. What we're seeing is there's maximum supposed to stay 14 days for business or tourism, but an increasing number are illegally getting on boats, because from there they're just supposed to stay in CNMI and going to Guam, and there have been verified at least several hundred, but possibly quite a bit more. And some have been found physically on the U.S. military bases, where some have been apprehended and then handed over to the FBI. And after that, we don't quite know what happens to them. This is a deep, deep concern for a lot of reasons. But if you're looking at a Taiwan contingency, if you're looking at taking Taiwan, which rumors are the Chinese may be interested in, your biggest problem is Guam, because Guam is it's where this majority of assets that can cause you problems are located. And we've seen them try to disable Guam through Volt Typhoon, through cyber, things like that. But having people on the ground, being able to hit unhardened infrastructure, being able to kill those planes before they take off the ground, for example, would be extremely helpful. So if one of your biggest targets is Taiwan, and one of your biggest problems is Guam, being able to slip into Guam without anybody being able to identify you, not passing through any borders where you're doing any background checks or anything like that, is very helpful. So this is a really serious issue. The governor of CNMI, Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, would like it stopped, would like the Chinese coming into that part of the U.S. to require visa like they do everywhere else in the U.S. And it's a decision to be made by Homeland Security. There was a letter from over 30 members of Congress asking for this loophole to be closed, and they won't do it. So
do you have any idea why?
So the letter from Homeland to the members of Congress explaining why says that the Chinese tourists were a big contributor to the economy of CNMI in 2008-2009 period. And so that's why.
Whoa, hang on. I would understand if, like, the U.S., I don't know, Commerce Department or something had that excuse, but Homeland Security, their job is security. So what is their concern about the economy?
Economic security the most important type of security, Matt?
Well, this is the opposite of economic security.
Yeah, it is.
But it's also interesting to me that if the governor of the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas Islands doesn't want them to have this loophole,
should have some sway.
Like, if the people of this area are saying no, then yeah, it just seems very odd.
Yeah. Yeah. And so there are some who want them, and that would be the Chamber of Commerce of CNMI, who are very vocal about wanting people from China to come in without a visa. Now, remember that it's not as if requiring a visa means it's going to kill tourism, right? It just means that you might have to plan your vacation a week in advance, or you can apply for a visa to do tourism. It's not a big deal. So that kind of argument goes by the wayside. And the argument of the governor is that Chinese tourism is very unstable as basis for an economy. And he points to Palau, for example, where China pulled all its tourists and tried to crash the economy, and saying that potentially there could be geopolitical issues that would make restrictions on tourists from China happen. And that in the past, they used to have the same deal for Russians, where Russians could arrive in CNMI without a visa. And that one was pulled. So just from an economic argument perspective, it doesn't really make sense either.
Well, also, you said it was like from 2008 to 2009, they were the biggest. We're talking
15
a
years
long
ago.
time ago. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and in the piece of and in this regulation that could be changed easily, it does say that this can be the regulation that allows it says it's to promote economic development, but it can be changed for national security reasons. I highly recommend every American who can go to CNMI. It's beautiful. It's interesting. It is a completely different part of the United States than people know. This is a part of the United States that was part of Japan from 1914 to 1944. And in fact, this summer, starting in September, will be the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Saipan, which is one of the most important battles of the Pacific Theater. Until that period, when the Americans liberated Saipan, the history of it is heartbreaking. This was a place where Japan set up as part of Japan. There were a lot of Japanese civilians there. There were watchmakers and cinemas, and it was a whole culture that ended in the kind of horrific and famous suicides of entire families. It was throwing themselves off the cliffs because of it was very, very similar to what you heard in Okinawa, for example. And when the Americans came in, it was the first time that the Marines really had to deal with a large civilian population. And I met some of the people who were children at that time, and they were hiding in caves with their families. And when the Marines came, and in one case, one woman, Maria Castro, talked about being brought out of the cave by the Marines and being given her first sip of water in weeks. And the memory of that moment of tenderness in the midst of war was so deep in her life that she later became a school teacher in Middle America during desegregation, to be kind of part of this bridge of healing America, bringing Black and white America together, which she felt she could do as somebody who was neither. Their connection to America is very deep, very inspiring in many ways, very touching, and is unlike anything else in the U.S. But they are geographically in this location that has meant that they are on the front line of geopolitics and in huge danger. Anytime Asia and America, or the Americas, come up against it, as they are now. And the current attack that they're under is this political warfare attack, which you've talked about a lot on the show. So the things like the casinos, that's not economics. I mean, part of it is economics, but a big part of it is also money laundering, infiltration of their political system, emplacement of strategic assets, dual use facilities. I mentioned that Tinian, which is the neighboring island of Saipan, that island was the island that had the busiest airport in the end of the war, because that's where the B-29s were taking off from to bomb Japan, and in fact, that's where the Enola Gay took off from. And the runways are still there, and those runways are what's being rehabilitated now. And this new little Chinese casino that's been put in is right on the harbor, right where the U.S. is going to be bringing in building supplies to work on the rest of the island. And this island is the linkage to the U.S. is very difficult to describe how deep it is. It's shaped when the Seabees first arrived. They said, you know what? It looks like Manhattan. It's kind of shaped like Manhattan. So they named all the streets as if they were in Manhattan. So there's a Broadway, there's a Central Park, there is today. That's how it's laid out. And the new hotel that's associated with this little casino, which is on a bluff overlooking the harbor, which is exactly where you'd want to be if you're going to be monitoring that kind of activity, was when I went there and saw it, I took a picture of the Chinese writing that gave the name of it and sent it to a friend who can read that. And apparently the name is the Chinese equivalent of the name of Chulu Beach, which is White Beach, which is where the Marines first came into attack on Tinian. So the idea that this is a beachhead, where the political warfare attack is coming from, is implicit in the name of the hotel linked to the casino that they're building on Tinian, where $400 million worth of Air Force infrastructure is going in.
Wow. This is insane, and it's also just shows, like, you on the fringes of American media, you'll get the stories about Chinese crossing the U.S. southern border, but
also I think the problem is that it becomes hard to figure out what's really happening on the southern border, because it's if you see things on Twitter, for example, there's no way to confirm exactly what's going on. So it's easy for about half the country to be like, okay, this is just some xenophobic scare. It's not really happening. Whereas when you try to dig down into what's actually happening, it becomes very difficult to understand what the truth of the matter is. Are these all Chinese soldiers coming across the border? Obviously not. But is there some kind of national security danger that could still be happening from all of these illegal crossings?
You're talking about the southern border still.
Yes. Yeah, that's not so easily dismissed. But I think your point was that this stuff doesn't get talked about even in the fringes, right?
Yeah, and this is very important because this is U.S. territory. This would be a critical place where any kind of war for Taiwan would happen. I mean, the Chinese military has talked about how to strike Guam, and it just amazes me how Chinese casinos worldwide are just these hubs of Chinese influence operations, human trafficking, drug.
Imagine a U.S. company trying to set up a casino or something else on Hainan Island in China, which is Hainan, of course, has a lot of military infrastructure for the People's Liberation Army. All right, so it would be the equivalent of that, but obviously the CCP would never in a million years allow something like that.
Yeah, because it's insane. Yeah.
That's what separates China from the U.S. We're insane.
Well, I mean, I think that even though, for example, I think a lot of Americans don't even know that this place is American, right?
Oh, they don't know the history of World War II.
Or, I mean, even when we first started about a decade ago talking about these Chinese casinos in Saipan, I didn't really know where
I was
Saipan
where
was.
is Saipan?
Yeah, I didn't understand that it was actually U.S. territory. It just sounds like another of the many islands in the South Pacific, which are small nations or whatever. So, yeah, I think that there is also a lot of obliviousness, I guess, to what is actually going on in that area.
The poor people of Saipan. So we've interviewed the governor and had some events with the people who run the college, things like that, and when they go to Washington, often they have to spend the first sort of 5-10 minutes explaining they're part of the United States. That they're, and one of the guys was saying, Yeah, usually we end up just going, yeah, we're near Hawaii. They're nowhere near Hawaii. They're much closer to Taiwan than they are to Hawaii. I mean, and they share a border with Japan. And
I mean, they're the most western part of the country.
Eastern.
yeah. And when I went there the last time, the cheapest way to get there was to fly to Korea and then take one of the cheap charter tourist flights from Korea. So they
Oh,
are,
wow.
they're currently their top tourist market, over, I think it's over 50% now, is Korean package holiday. Well, Korean holidays, family holidays. It's about a 4-hour flight from Seoul.
I can see why you were recommending Americans travel there. You're
Yeah.
working for the Saipan Board of Tourism, aren't you?
Well,
That's what this is about.
So leave your comment below if you'd like to visit Saipan or Tinian, but will only do so once they fix their visa requirements for Chinese tourists.
Oh no, then you're just then you're punishing the people of CNMI. If they can say to the to Homeland or whoever, look, we've got so many American tourists, we don't need these Chinese tourists. But I can tell you what you can do. You can leave a comment below to United Airlines to say, drop your crazy, insane prices to get to CNMI. Because they've got this kind of lock on the market that makes it much more expensive than it should be. Although you can use points to get there.
Let's try to find another airline that's willing to do that, and then you have market competition. That'll drive the prices back to normal.
Spirit.
Yeah.
No, please, anyone but Spirit. But
well,
if you're watching Delta,
if it's in the
or
western part of the U.S., maybe we can get Southwest
Alaska.
interested.
You're right. Can't do that if it's the eastern part of the U.S., can you, Matt?
How about a different airline?
But this raises sort of actually some interesting issues, which is one of the problems that they have, and that it's such an unusual part of the U.S. that it gets these odd little things like this immigration crazy loophole, but there's a big downside to it. So, for example, they had a very big typhoon, and it destroyed a lot of their college campus, and FEMA wanted to rebuild it, but they used a pricing that would be as if you can kind of go to the hardware store in Milwaukee and go and pick up stuff there. But they're at the end of such a long supply chain that things are way more expensive. So it took a lot more money and a lot more time to get their campus rebuilt. But similarly on tourism, what they would like to do is build up the Japanese market. And Japan is apparently sort of interested, but just going to Saipan and back wouldn't make as much sense as if Japan Airlines could go to Saipan and then go to Guam and then come back from there. But that Saipan Guam leg is a domestic US flight. And there are regulations around international airlines being able to fly domestic routes. So, yeah. So once you start kind of looking at just the little things that are holding back major alternatives to this PRC political warfare attack, you can see that very small changes, like giving an exemption to Japan Airlines to be able to do that leg, would actually be kind of transformational, make a big difference. So this United Airlines thing, if we end up talking about anywhere else in the Pacific, they're also a big problem for reaching the U.S. freely associated states of Marshall Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, and Palau, because they control or have exclusivity largely on those routes as well. And the prices, again, are very high. So, what it takes is you put in, the U.S. is putting in $400 million for airfield in Tinian and another similar amount in Yap, but not that's kind of the kinetic warfare front. But there's very little, if no, defense on the political warfare front. And that's where the PRC is just romping it. And if you then try to use your kinetic, you may find out that you've been effectively disabled, surrounded, and become unable to operate because the political warfare front has been so effective. The governor of CNMI now is an exceptional man who came into office and found just that the corruption of the previous administrations had literally looted the coffers, but also his office to the point where furniture was missing. And he's asked the federal government to come in with FBI, a resident district attorney, treasury officials, and look at his books. He's not a lot of politicians will say, come investigate me and my government. We're opening up everything. Please clean us up. And the U.S. government is really, really slow to act. So if we don't go after the corruption, and this flow of money through the casinos and this emplacement near critical installations, then you're building a $400 million base or operating location that either won't be effective, or in the worst case, if you're looking at a different country, will end up like Bagram, being handed over to somebody who does not wish you well.
Do you think this is part of a general blindness in the US government to political warfare tactics, or is it more about the priority of the South Pacific among the US government priorities?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. I think to a degree, both, but the US government is not monolithic. And clearly, the Department of Defense knows that it's important. So that's why they're putting in the installations. And I would think that, which means that they're at least having the conversations internally. And I know that there are some very good people within DoD that are trying to broaden out the remit so that they can provide more on the ground of what's actually needed. So as you know better than anybody, the PRC comes in with things that in many cases the locals need, or at least local leadership wants, like infrastructure and things like that, which are things that DoD through the CBs and others can provide extremely easily, and would in fact help with operations in the area anyway, but would shore up with the political warfare front. So more of that kind of engagement. I think DoD is thinking about that already. They should have been thinking about it 30 years ago, but okay, better late than never. State Department, well, first of all, of course, CNMI, part of the problem with specifically CNMI is that it's run through the Department of Interior, in part. So one government official from CNMI was saying it's us and the buffalo. That's kind of sort of. So there's an issue there. The insular territories are not given, even though they have a representative in Congress, but they're not taken as seriously, and they kind of fall between the cracks. The other ones in the Pacific under state we saw it with the near catastrophe with the renewal of the Compacts of Free Association, how it took a presidential envoy to get those through, and it took some very, very good congressional staffers. And if I may take a moment of appreciation for congressional staffers, which is very rarely done. In this case, getting these compacts through Congress was done because you had Republican and Democrat staffers in both the House and the Senate deciding this was a priority and it really had to get through. And this is this agreement, the financial and services component of the agreement that underpins the relationship the U.S. has with Palau, Marshall Islands, Federated States of Micronesia. We've talked about it before. We can talk about it again if you want. But I'm an outsider, so I haven't really seen how Congress works. The staffers have a lot of power, as we've talked about before, and they really pulled it out. They really got it done. So there are parts of the U.S. government that have realized how important it is and really are doing their best at cost of other issues, because there's only a limited amount of time and money. But at the bottom of it, I think personally, is the lack of willingness to understand that the Chinese Communist Party is an enemy, and it is well-funded, well-equipped, with an enormous amount of intelligence, an enormous amount of on-the-ground resources, enemy, that anything you try to build that is positive, they will try to block. It's less than a zero-sum game. It's not, they are willing to lose if you lose more on the ground. So anything that you try to do has to have a defensive component to it. You need to block the malign influence while you're building up the positive engagement. And that, I think, is missing.
That's kind of like the example you were giving of the airfield, where it doesn't matter that on the surface it seems like you're spending money doing something to counter Chinese influence in the Pacific, but because of this other glaring loophole, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, that's right. And those loopholes are not unnoticed by the Chinese Communist Party. That's why you would see the other proxies, like, I would argue, the Chamber of Commerce of the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana is pushing for the loophole. So the CCP may not have a lock on the governor like they may have had in the past, but they've got these other proxies that can come into play to push for that loophole to continue. So they know, undoubtedly, they understand the operations of CNMI better than almost anybody in Washington, and they will play those levers as they go through to a specific end. That's the other thing.
Well, yeah, because the Chinese Communist Party knows that the United States is its enemy, so they are strategizing how to beat us. The U.S. is not doing that. But I think you made a good point about the congressional staffers and the role they can play, because a lot of times people ask us, what can we do? And there are actually a lot of ways people can influence the American government. You don't have to be elected to Congress. Congressional staffers have a tremendous influence. Even writing in and talking to these congressional staffers, or talking to your congressman or woman, can really have an influence. Like, if people watching this podcast start writing in about this loophole, that would have an impact.
Yeah, or become a congressional staffer.
I assume that is not the easiest job to get.
Well, I don't know, Shelley, what do you think?
It's actually not terribly hard to get an internship at
the district office.
At the district office. It is definitely harder to get an internship in the Washington, D.C. office, but it is not too hard to get an internship at the district office. And then you can kind of see if this is something you would like to do, actually. And Congress people do spend a lot of time in their district offices when Congress is not in session.
Yeah, and that's good, because a lot of people don't think that, that's valuable to do. Like, there's not a big rush of people trying to get a district office job as a congressional staffer.
No, because I think everybody's very focused on Washington.
Yeah, and that is a mistake.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a different way of doing it, in a sense. But there's no reason you couldn't get to Washington through a district office.
So if you were let us say, Chinese Communist Party agent who wanted to gain influence in Washington, would you put interns into congressional offices in places like, say, California?
Uh-oh, this is getting real.
Um,
Ugh.
So I come up with this great idea, and the CCP has already thought of it and is undermining the U.S. Is that what you're saying, Cleo?
The complete hypothetical, total and complete hypothetical.
I mean,
Need
but
some
first you have to
coffee.
start by cultivating U.S. politicians at the local level so that when they do become congressmen or women,
What if you had a beautiful Chinese spy?
yeah, and then she could maybe call in a favor to get somebody placed as an intern in a district office. Yeah.
Man.
Point is, the point is, in this complete hypothetical, is if they're doing it, that means it's worth being done, right? And if you're
That's true.
if good guys are in those places, you're filling the place that a bad guy might be trying to fill.
So what you're saying is China Uncensored needs to start a casino on the Mariana Islands.
That's exactly right. That's exactly what I'm saying.
Sweet.
Yeah. Yeah.
We can launder all the money we make from this show.
Yes. The house always wins.
But what I'm actually saying is learn how your government works. It's not that hard to be part of the process, and once you're part of the process, you may come up with solutions and ideas that nobody else has thought of because your background is unique and your thoughts and contexts are unique. It's there are really good people in the government and we're talking about the US now, but this applies to anybody who's watching from other parts of the world as well. It's not that hard to get involved in your government, and if you're watching this show, then you probably care about the future and are trying to understand how things are now, and it's easy to be really dismissive of government. Oh, they're all corrupt, or it never works, things like that.
Everything's run by the reptiles.
Yes. Well, at the end, obviously, yeah. But if you are willing to live close to those cold-blooded creatures that are politicians, then it might be worth volunteering. It depends on what age of your life you're at, what stage of your career you're at, but get involved. You can write letters or send emails or just get involved and figure out how it works so that you can figure out how to write that letter later on that's really going to strike home.
This is great. I feel like this is one of our most optimistic, positive podcasts. Yes, after starting in this horrible, bleak spot.
Oh, just wait till we start talking about the Solomon Islands.
We should probably do that before we run out of time. Because I think the Solomon Islands are an example of like how bad things can get. And I want to hear from you where you think things are right now. We should probably give a little bit of background. How do we want to? How best do we want to do that?
Do we want to start from the election that just happened last?
Or do we need background?
I would start from 2019 when at that time the Prime Minister Manasseh Sogavari did what they call the switch, which is switching diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to the PRC. And he'd already been Prime Minister, I think, for a couple of years at the time. But
he had been Prime Minister before, but he was elected again in 2019.
Okay, and then he did the switch, and then that's when like everything started to change.
Well, already by that point,
Islands.
there were, like as Cleo has mentioned on the show, lots of Chinese influence operations, economic activity in the country, money being placed in the hands of politicians. Very similar to what it sounds like the previous governor of Mariana Islands might have been kind of been doing.
Well, it's a snowball effect, right? Like the CCP had to build up all those things for them to make the switch, which then itself triggered even more of the Chinese influence, right?
Yes. Sorry. Just legal disclaimer. unproven allegations against the previous governor of CNMI in spite of ongoing investigations by a special prosecutor. And
He's a reptile.
yes, and this may give you headaches, nausea, incontinence, whatever. I'm giving the entire disclaimer around the.
That's the disclaimer of every episode of our show.
Yeah.
But so the
Wait,
point.
no, she has more to say here, right?
Okay.
Yes, I am going check to what Matt just said about Solomon's. Yes. So, but this that's why the Solomon's case is heartbreaking, but also really worth taking a close look at, because unusually we have the start date of 2019 where there was a switch. So it gives you a sense of what China, they had obviously been on the ground very effectively beforehand in order to get the switch to happen. But you've got this start point from which you can see what happens when China just goes full bore into a country. And by the way, one of the ways that they happened to be able to do the switch was through this kind of subnational building up of a local.
Did we say the switch was going from recognizing Taiwan to recognizing mainland China? In
That's
case we
right.
didn't say that.
Yes, we did.
That's
Okay.
right. Yeah. Yeah. I know you were out for a little while and just came back into the room and missed that.
Hey, at least mentally, he was out for a little while. And then just
He
came
was
back
thinking
into the
about
room.
reptiles.
I was.
Oh, and Rome.
Rome. I wonder if the reptiles were active back then as well.
Yeah.
I mean, there were politicians in Rome.
That's true. I'll go on the internet. I'm sure there's lots of fun websites I can go to.
We have a guest, Chris.
Okay. Cleo, go ahead. I'm going to look up reptilians in ancient Rome.
Okay. Do you want me to wait?
No. Please, just go ahead.
So they went in through, and the point of this is that they developed a strong relationship with the guy that runs Guadalcanal. Now, this is, again, we're back to our World War II history, right? So Solomon Islands is the site of the Battle of the Guadalcanal. The capital is on the island of Guadalcanal. This is where Iron Bottom Sound is, where Bloody Ridge is. I mean, these are a lot of Americans died. Others as well. The Coast Watchers, the local Solomon Islanders saved countless lives, and in fact may have changed the whole course of the war. So this is a place like Saipan where you don't want to you don't want to take it lightly, because the amount of blood that's soaked into those beaches. The last time you had an expansionist Asian power run through the area, was horrific. And you've had Professor Toshioshi Hara on, and he wrote an excellent monograph about how the PLA has studied in depth the war in the Pacific, learning both from the Japanese and from the American sides about what's important, where to place, what the weaknesses are. And one of his findings is that he thinks that it's very possible that the PLA thinks that the American Navy looks a lot like the Japanese Navy in World War II, which is it's large, but it's brittle. So we keep hearkening back to the war, first of all, because so many Americans died, and for reasons that resonate still today, in terms of freedom and openness and all that stuff, but also because the strategic importance hasn't changed, and the PLA has looked at it very carefully. And after 2019, one of the first places that Chinese-linked companies tried to get a hold of physically lease was Tulagi, which was the first place that the Japanese hit when they came into the Solomons, and that was because that was where the British had set up their headquarters. The geography hasn't changed, right? So if you go back to that period, you can see these patterns developing. And what China, I would argue, is trying to do is set itself up through political warfare in the same way that the the Japanese set themselves up through kinetic warfare in a place like Solomon's, although in a place like Saipan, of course, they already had control over it because of the League of Nations. So what happened is they cultivated these subnational groups, and it was the governor of Guadalcanal, and then he came into the central government when Sogavare was elected in 2019, and you had this switch. And not everybody was delighted with the switch. And good friend of the show, and the show has been a very good friend to him, Daniel Suidani, was at that moment the premier of the most populous province in the Solomons, Malaita province. And he and his government and the traditional chiefs of Malaita issued the Auki communique. Auki is the capital of Malaita, AUKI, which is one of the most courageous documents I've seen in this political warfare battle against the Chinese Communist Party. And it says that they want to put a moratorium on any new Chinese-linked companies operating in the province. And they give a whole list of reasons, including they don't want to live in a police state, and that they believe in freedom of religion, as opposed to the Chinese Communist Party, which is a systemically atheist system. It's a document of just simple clarity about why you don't want to let the Chinese Communist Party come into your jurisdiction and run your economy, and through your economy affect your society and your politics. That marked him out as enemy number one in the Solomon Islands. And when he needed medical care, not long after that, he had some health issues and he needed an MRI. And there's no MRI in the country. And under normal circumstances, the central government would help pay for this, for the medical treatment outside the country if you're the premier of a province. And they said effectively, not officially, but through intermediaries, if you let the Chinese come in, we'll give you the money for the treatment. And he said no. So this is a man who has shown he would literally rather die than take Chinese money and compromise the future of his people. The Australians said, and what the Australians say is relevant because strategically in this area, the US has delegated a lot of the leadership to Australia, said, sure, you can come to Australia for medical care, but you're going to have to raise like $100,000 to put up in advance. And this is an honest politician whose monthly salary is about $800. So he didn't have the money for that. What ended up happening was, and this is a free and open Indo-Pacific story, an Indian professor who you've had on the show, Professor Nalapat, ended up hearing about it. And he knows President Tsai, who is then president of Taiwan, and got in touch with her office directly. And she personally intervened to enable him to come to Taiwan for the medical treatment that he needed. But while he was away, the Chinese and the Chinese proxies started spreading money around Malaita to try to buy up enough of the members of the provincial legislature to get him out as premier. Condensing a lot of history here, but they on the third attempt, he came back to the country, and on the third attempt, they got him out. And then not long after that, the central government, the Minister for Provincial Relations, disqualified him even from his elected seat because he wouldn't acknowledge China's definition of a one China policy. So
which was absolutely crazy because that was directly the Chinese government pressuring another government to kick out an elected official.
Yes. So this is the first case I've found, maybe you know more than I do, of Beijing getting a veto over the voters of another country over who elects them. I don't know if over who they can elect. I don't know if you know of any other case.
But I thought the China didn't interfere in the internal affairs of other countries.
Well, obviously,
That's what they've told us.
Yeah, they obviously don't think Solomon's is another country.
That's true.
Yeah,
With secret security pacts, secret police agreements.
Yeah, and it was shortly after the events you're just describing that our fans of China Unscripted and China Uncensored really came together and helped raise enough money to bring Suidani to Washington, D.C., where he and his assistant were able to meet with all of these different, U.S. officials and, politicians and actually bring awareness to this issue.
Yes. So what happened after that? So back to where he was. So he's lost the premiership, had the premiership taken away. And by the way, one of the things that he had done when he was premier was the prime minister of the country had said they were going to put in 160 Huawei towers, and he had blocked the installation of the Huawei towers from his province. And as soon as they got rid of him as premier, Huawei survey crews came in and they started surveying for the Huawei towers. So he's lost his provincial premiership, he's lost his seat, and then he's invited to New York to speak at a UN event on Indigenous leadership, because he's painted or dismissed in the press as kind of a pro-US pawn and all that stuff. He is not. He is pro-democracy, pro the people of Malaita, and part of that is he's a very strong environmentalist. He doesn't want the Chinese logging companies to come in and destroy the physical environment, which his people depend on. So he had been invited to this conference, and the State Department declined his visa. Then some members of Congress got involved. Back to heroic members of Congress who thought anybody would say that, to write a letter to the State Department saying, "Hey, what's going on? Like this guy is exactly the sort of person you'd want in the United States. He's representing the sort of democratic values that the founders envisaged and is fighting on the front line of a very hard fight." So eventually
it's another case like what you were talking about earlier with Homeland Security and Mariana, where it's like sometimes the U.S. government makes very weird decisions when it comes to China.
Yeah. And this was definitely one of them. And completely coincidentally, a high-ranking State Department official was heading to the Solomon Islands at about the same time that the visa was declined, and Sugavari, the pro-China Prime Minister of the Solomons, had made a big deal out of U.S. support for Suidani, and there were pieces in the press that were saying that Suidani had actually gone to Taiwan to collude with Taiwan and the U.S. to do an assassination attempt on the leader of the Solomons. Like the full force of the disinformation was there, and I think that some people in state may have not thought about it at all, or some may have thought, we don't want to be associated with this. This complicates things for us, which is just, I would argue, a sign of weakness. It's,
Well, I also remember one of the reasons we were doing all this for him is because we wanted to, and this was in discussions with you, raise his profile enough so that when he did go back to the Solomon Islands, he couldn't just be disappeared or put on trial for something.
Yeah.
Bogus.
So he got the visa. The reason I'm going through all these details is because something that you're seeing, I saw it in the press recently, is that part of the attempt to dismiss him is to say that he's being used by the U.S. as a stooge. And a recent piece said that his trip was supported by the U.S. or U.S. The implications was that U.S. government had brought him to the U.S. to make all these anti-China statements. And so it's really important to make it clear that that first leg of the trip from Solomons to New York was supported by an environmental NGO, and he went to New York and he talked about environmental issues. And then the incredible China Uncensored, China Unscripted army got involved and said, we want to hear what this man has to say, because he's on the front line of this political warfare battle. And it's important that more people know about what's going on the ground. And then you guys got involved, and I think you raised $500 million in 50 seconds or something like that.
That's entirely accurate.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then there was a whole thing. It was GoFundMe, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And they didn't want to release the money.
They wouldn't release the money.
It was not $500 million.
It was 27,000 or so, which is incredible, by the way. Which is to say that all y'all watching are amazing.
Yes.
What happened though is GoFundMe wouldn't release the money they wouldn't tell us the reason. And then it was really frustrating because we're like, oh, well, like what's going to happen? And, we were going to,
because he was in the US. He was
like, we needed this money ASAP. And then, basically we'd already fronted some of the money from our own pockets to make sure like it didn't all, go to hell really quickly. We told GoFundMe, this is right before he was going to, I think, testify before Congress. And so we told GoFundMe that there was going to be this testimony before Congress, which might have to include a mention of how funds are being restricted without reason. And then weirdly, like within a few hours, GoFundMe had suddenly released the money, also with no explanation.
This was after like about a week.
Yeah.
Of just holding on to the money.
Yeah.
So
weird things with China.
And he wasn't the only one that testified before Congress, I think, was he?
Oh, yes. Technically, I have testified before Congress.
Yep.
I think I changed the world.
Every day, in every way.
Yes, this world we live in now, everyone can thank me for that. Oh, God. I can't even.
Yeah.
I can't even. That's like some kind of sin.
Yeah.
I think.
So he came to DC, and thanks to you, and the money was also used for his court cases, because as always with this China stuff, there's kind of relentless lawfare, which is ongoing. But when he was in DC, he spoke to a wide range of people. And then he went back to Solomon's, and there was really concern about his safety. But he got back safely, and the Solomons have just had another election. And while he was out of the province and out of power, they started, the first Huawei tower has gone up, for example. And the new premier of Malaita province, one of the first things he did was cancel the Auki communique and get on a plane and go to China. In the election, that premier lost his seat, and so did the majority of the people who had joined him in that new government. So the people of Malaita were very clear, we don't want to have anything to do with these guys. And Sudani himself was reelected in a landslide. Similar thing happened at the national level. So they had both elections at the same time, the provincial election and the national election. So it would be like voting for your state house and Congress at the same time. And at the national level, the government grouping that was pro-China also lost the majority of their seats, although Sogavari was reelected by a slim margin. And a lot of those people, there's very likely to be court challenges because there was a lot of bribery involved, very overt bribery. Their political system is very different than the U.S. system. The political party system is very loose, and it's a parliamentary system. So you vote for your representative, and then the representatives get together and select who's going to be prime minister or who's going to be premier. And at that phase, there was that. So the election can be clean, but if the pro-China forces can influence enough of those people at the federal level, national level, it's 50. If they can get 26 of them on side, then they can put together their government. And there were a lot of independents. And that's exactly what happened. So Sogavare stepped aside as the premier candidate, but his foreign minister, who's the guy who negotiated the switch and who is involved in that security deal, which can allow for the deployment of PLA forces in the Solomons, Jeremiah Manele, he became prime minister, and Sogavare became finance minister, which is exactly where you want a guy who
Likes money.
Yeah. So
And can funnel CCP money around.
There are such incredible heroes in Solomon Islands. One of them, or a few of them, are in journalism, and two of them contributed to an article that came out before the election that looked at Sogavare's property empire in Solomons. So on his small budget, he somehow managed to amass 8 properties, and this is Charlie Perengi and Mufana Ermai. They even found the bank that had issued the mortgages, which clearly make no sense. It's a French bank. So that means that if anybody wanted to go after the corruption, they could. This is a bank that's part of the Western banking system. The French want to be a better player, but we know that there are also undoubtedly money that's getting laundered through Australian and New Zealand bank accounts and real estates, and nobody's doing anything about it. Just these people on the ground, these journalists, these local leaders, just desperately trying to clean their place up, just like the governor of CNMI, and getting no outside help. So what's the end result of all of this? You ended up with a very pro-PRC government nationally, and at the local level, the Sudani level in Malaita, they were getting calls, these 33 so you need 17 out of the 33 to form the government. They were getting calls saying, if you join us, the pro-Chinese guys, you'll get the equivalent of about $35,000 in cash, and you'll get development projects in your district from the federal government, national government, from China, and from Australia, New Zealand, and the US, because they all want to work with us at the national level. If you don't, you get nothing. You get no development projects, and good luck to you. At the same time, there was a huge disinformation campaign running against Sogavare, saying, twisting all of the stuff that we've just talked about, all of this.
Doing Sudani?
Yeah, sorry, but against Sudani personally, to the point where he himself had to withdraw from running from premier because it was distracting from what his group was trying to do. And in the end, the pro-China faction also won in Malaita. And one of the first announcements they made was how much they're looking forward to working with China in the province. So the voters were very clear. They didn't want this. And the outcome was something completely different. And where's all the international coverage and help about all that?
And so to zoom out, I think what's important in this is what China's doing is very strategically putting money in the right pockets. And buying off countries around the Pacific, around the world, actually, in opposition to what the people actually want. But this is all being done through Western banking systems. And if the West can crack down on this very easily. And again, that goes back to kind of that congressional staffer level thing. If people in these countries put pressure on their government, they can put pressure on the Chinese Communist Party. Am I wrong in saying that this is something that could happen?
Oh no, I think it's very, very easy, and if anybody's watching in Australia or New Zealand or anywhere where these banking systems touch, it is your duty. And the Australians have a bunch of excuses. They'll say, we don't want to look like we're interfering in internal politics. Well, if the money is going through the Australian or New Zealand systems, which it is, then it is your duty to the Australian and New Zealand people to make sure that your systems are clean. So that's one thing. The other thing is the other thing that they'll say, the Australians and New Zealanders will say often, the Australians in particular, is we don't want to we don't meet with the opposition, and we don't want to do subnational engagement because we don't want the Chinese dealing with our opposition or dealing with
as they are.
Yeah. Right.
I'm just thinking about Daniel Andrews in charge of Victoria State in Australia, and how basically, even though he was like a local premier at a subnational level, he was heavily influenced by what the CCP wanted
he the
to
guy
do in that
who
province.
signed a Belt and Road agreement for that province?
Port of Victoria, I think.
Yeah.
So
they will use, the Australians, I've heard it happened to me, will use that example to say why they don't want China to be able to do that in their place, and so that's why they're not doing it elsewhere.
So you set up an agreement with the CCP that, if you don't interfere with us at this level, then we won't interfere with you, and then we hold ourselves to this agreement on our side, but they obviously don't hold themselves to an agreement.
I mean,
right?
I don't think that there's even an agreement.
There's
right?
not. I'm just saying that there's no world in which,
if we play nice, then China will too.
There we go. There's no world in which that is the actual reality.
And why not just apply reciprocity rules? Say, okay, China can't do us at a subnational level because we can't do it in China, right? But it's not like Australia isn't engaging with Texas for investment or whatever. And it's not like they're sitting in Washington and only talking to Democrats when the Democrats are in power, not talking to Republicans. It's, if you're a democracy, you engage differently. So it's a kind of it's a convenient excuse that doesn't stand up to logical interrogation. And
does stand up to all the Chinese money in Australia, though.
Well, you may say so, but I couldn't possibly comment. So there's that problem, and then there's the problem of Australian and New Zealand media and academia. There's when this article first we wrote about that. I wrote a piece with Grant Newsham that was looking at this, and if you haven't heard about what's going on in the Solomon Islands, it's in part because there's very little coverage. And when the election did happen, what coverage there was focused mostly on the fact that Sugawari wasn't prime minister. But we knew that he would probably end up in the cabinet, and we knew that the fight wasn't over because you're waiting to see what would happen in the provinces. But there was that flurry of initial coverage. And this goes to how good the CCP is at understanding our systems and manipulating our systems. And you're getting articles like Australia breathes a sigh of relief as Sugawari steps aside as prime minister, without follow-up coverage on a lot of this other stuff.
Yeah, I feel like we were a little guilty of that too, because we covered the initial elections fairly in depth, but
which seemed more optimistic.
Which seemed more optimistic at the time, and then we did a follow-up, briefly about Sugawari becoming finance minister, but we didn't. Well, we haven't looked at what happened provincially since then.
Yeah, well, I mean, we had Cleo on right now.
Good. Yeah, good thing you're not regaling the audience with 15 hours of domestic Solomon Islands politics at the moment. But to be fair, if I can quote a famous Canadian television show, we didn't really know what the outcome would be until this past week when we finally had the Malaita outcome for premier. So now we can step back and take a look at this whole picture of what happened. And what happened is, I would argue, the worst possible outcome, because this boogeyman of Sugawari is not as visible. You've got a much more polished politician leading Solomon Islands. He is known not, he's pro-Cuba, pro-China, but he'll say a lot of things in a way that will allow people to discount the threat. And Sudani's out. That disqualification case where they took away his seat for having not recognized the one China policy, that's still pending in the Supreme Court. So I think that's going to be heard. The final thing is going to be, or the next phase is going to be in June. So there is still the potential for him to be disqualified. And at that point, it will be a test to see how compromised the judiciary has become in Solomon Islands. So I think it's very much worth taking a look at this entire procedure of what happened in Solomon's. I think the Chinese thought they didn't have enough in place to have the election when it was supposed to be held last year, which was one of the reasons why they bought off enough people in the parliament to delay the elections by a year by changing the constitution. And they knew that the West would mostly be looking at election day. So the election observers can go home and say, it was mostly free and fair. There were no problems at the election box, at the voting booths. But then you steal it when nobody's really paying much attention anymore. And I think I'm extremely concerned. I think that, the other Huawei towers are going to go in. They're talking about putting in an international port in Malaita. There's the words that you never want to hear coming out of a prime minister mouth. One of the first things that the new prime minister announced was that they were looking at legislation setting up special economic zones in Solomon Islands. This is going in a really dangerous direction, and there's just no help. Like if you are a representative of a district in Malaita and you've got no health care center, your expectant mothers have to walk over terrible roads for kilometers and kilometers to get to a clinic to give birth. And they may or may not have medicine in the clinic. Your school system is in terrible shape. There are no jobs for your young people. And you're sitting there deciding which premier you're going to support. And one side says, we'll give you all sorts of development projects from the national government, from the Chinese, from the Australians, from the Americans, that's us. And the other side is saying, don't sell your soul. We can't promise you anything except democracy and freedom. What are you supposed to do?
Well, how many of those, provincial elected officials voted for freedom versus money?
So, biblical 12 out of the 33. So they got 21 went with, we don't like this choice, but it's the only choice we have, and 12 stuck with freedom and democracy. And to me, it is a miracle that 12 stood up. And this is the other thing. Just like in Congress, there are all these people working hard to try to get things done. In DOD, there are all these people working hard to try to get things done. In state, there are people working hard to try to get things done. These people have seen what the system is doing to Suidani and to Celsus Telefilu, who is the other person who is in the U.S., very, very knowledgeable on all of these topics. He was running at the national level, and he lost by a very small amount, and he'll be challenging that loss because there was alleged overt bribery going on during that campaign. But the fact that 1/3 of those leaders were willing to make that very principled and courageous stand, having seen nobody else in the world except China Uncensored viewers is standing by their side, is an incredible testament to their courage and principles. Um, and I and they are inspirational and are a reason for us all to keep going in this fight. If given everything that they're up against in such really difficult circumstances, they're willing to fight, then we have no excuse.
And I think the thing that also needs to be said is this promise of infrastructure coming from China. We've seen this pattern around the world. It never materializes. What will materialize is Huawei towers that could be used for military purposes, these special economic zones, these ports that will be used to prepare for a war to invade Taiwan.
Yeah, I would. So this is interesting because again, why I've learned a lot from the situation of Solomons is the Chinese are adapting. So in the case of Solomons, one of their big concerns is healthcare, and there are Chinese doctors in the main hospital in Solomon Islands delivering healthcare, and they're now talking about putting in a new wing that it was essentially contingent on. They announced it for before the election to be put in after the election, with the kind of implicit thing. Well, if you bring us in, then we'll. And I think it's not unlikely that they will put in a hospital because, not to be too cynical, but I think they probably wouldn't mind having a hospital around that they have control over in case there is something kinetic, because then they can take it over for military purposes. I mean, thinking of hospitals as a dual use facility in that context, but also as a data gathering platform. I think one of the reasons why the PSARC goes around getting DNA from all over the Pacific and elsewhere as it does its programs is it very helpful information gathering tool. Doctors can ask questions that members of the general people can't, very personal questions of their patients. But also there's a symbolism to it. The Australians have been there engaged in Solomons for decades and decades and have not trained a single doctor up to some specialism stuff, but they haven't created a doctor. The Cubans have created quite a few Solomon Islander doctors. So in terms of signaling, I think there is an evolution of the way that the Chinese are engaging in the region, that the tofu infrastructure stuff it's still there, but they're definitely upping their game in terms of making that narrative becoming a little bit more difficult to deliver as other things come online. Now, they may be things that are of particular use to the Chinese also, but it can present directly as, we're giving you a hospital, the Australians aren't. And by the way, it'll have all these potential other uses for us as well as we move forward in our plans.
I think there is one more thing I would like to touch on, since this is sort of now what's next, the next step. Another Pacific island nation, Tuvalu, it's one of the only 12 countries left that still recognizes Taiwan. And now they're considering switching, just like the Solomon Islands. Why?
So I don't know how much they're considering switching there, but the interesting thing about Tuvalu is has about 12,000 people in it, and it's one of the atoll countries. They're very low lying, and they have serious concerns about environmental change, sea level rise, the habitability of their islands. Now, this is a geomorphologically complex location, in that their islands have always been changing. So they move with they've moved with tides and things. But we are building now infrastructure in locations that are static, so it's much more difficult for that geography to adapt. Also, the sea level rise affects different locations differently. Some places aren't getting sea level rise. They definitely do seem to be affected, and also infiltration of salt water into the groundwater, all that sort of stuff. This environmental change stuff is complex. And they have been asking for a long time for a relationship with a bigger country to stabilize their situation. And China actually offered them their magic island building dredgers that were being used in the South China Sea to build islands to reinforce their islands. And again, in an act of incredible courage, they said no. And they've stuck with Taiwan. So again, this is kind of an entire country that said we'd rather die than take Chinese money. And a lot of it's based on actual principle. There are people, believe it or not, who actually believe in democracy, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, all that sort of stuff, and are fighting for it in ways that are incredibly just touching, but also heartbreaking because they're not getting support. Anyway, Tuvalu. Australia offered it a deal where they would take in a couple of hundred climate refugees max, or a few hundred, 200 or 300 a year, in exchange for essentially kind of what it looked like originally foreign policy control and strategic denial. That's what this original agreement looked like, this Philippine agreement. Then they did it. It was signed. It was an agreement signed by the Prime Minister of Australia and the Prime Minister of Tuvalu. No public consultation. Then he went back. Prime Minister of Tuvalu went back and lost the election. He was not reelected. The new government has just come in and has renegotiated to a certain degree this deal with Australia. They've made it clear that the U.S. wouldn't preclude Tuvalu from entering agreement with other countries. There would be more money involved, things like that. My concern with this is that Australia is replicating the Chinese model, where you can have a government-to-government agreement that fundamentally affects the shape of a country, their strategic constraints, their nation-to-nation engagement, without a referendum. So in the case of the U.S. equivalent of these sort of agreements in Palau, Marshall Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, that arrangement, the Compacts of Free Association, were voted on by the people of those countries. The Australians did not go that route. It was government to government. That's a Chinese style agreement. That is a precedent that no matter what is in the agreement, and I have a lot of problems with what's in the agreement, because the Australians, for example, one of the things that they dangled was, we'll defend you militarily. Well, unless Kiribati attacks Tuvalu, there's no dynamic in which the Australian military can spare capacity just to go defend Tuvalu. They'd have to, kind of go through New Caledonia. It's very far, all that stuff. And Australia will be undoubtedly under attack at the same time, right? If you're going after Tuvalu, then you're probably going to go after Australia. They're not going to divert assets to go protect Tuvalu. Second, they say they'd help in the case of humanitarian assistance. Well, if there's something bad that happens, like a typhoon. That's the Australians elbowed out the U.S. and others when Tonga was hit by a volcano and then a tsunami and an earthquake, and like every biblical, the only thing they didn't have was locust all at the same time. And they said, don't worry, we're going to get it. Well, we've got it covered. The Australians sent their big ship and it broke down in port, complete electrical failure. And the Tongans think that and this could be political warfare, that they also gave them COVID. It was at a period when the Tongans didn't have COVID, and suddenly Australians show up and it was COVID. Now that could be Chinese political warfare, but whatever. So those things that Australia says they're going to be able to deliver just logistically, I don't see how they could do it, which is a very bad precedent because they're telling others we can do it, so others won't look at being able to do it. And they're worse, they're legitimizing that sort of government to government. Now, their legislatures will have to vote on it, but the people aren't involved. Fundamental change in sovereignty. This is something that I'm sure people in Beijing are going, great. Now we can do this with all sorts of other countries. And if anybody complains, we can say, look, the Australians did it. So that's a real problem. As for this switch from Taiwan, I'm concerned that the Australians will not support Tuvalu and its principled stand. Australia, if China says, we're going to start squeezing you economically, Australia, unless Tuvalu switches its stand, I don't think you're going to see a lot of Australian diplomats saying to Tuvalu, yes, keep going with your quixotic support for Taiwan. So I don't see increased Australian influence in Tuvalu as a hedge for the pro-Taiwan forces. I see it as potentially a Trojan horse for elements that would like to see Tuvalu move away from Taiwan.
Well, is there anything else we want to cover while we have Cleo on? I know we don't often have her
I
on.
mean, I just feel like this is a story of like the West once again failing the South Pacific.
How the
in
West was
so
dumb.
many ways.
Well, it's like it may be many years before Tuvalu switches from Taiwan to the PRC, but it sounds like unless something is done, then at some point that switch will happen. And then once that happens, then the whole snowball effect that we've seen in the Solomon Islands could very well happen in Tuvalu. And then that's just another domino that has fallen.
I wonder what will come first, China trying to invade or China successfully getting every country to switch?
Why not both?
So I think that they're pushing on all doors at the same time, and it's worth looking at. You mentioned that kind of internal domino effect of degradation of the pillars of independence and sovereignty and democracy. And Kiribati, which is the neighboring country to Tuvalu, switched at the same time the Solomons did. And another thing that's going on currently is they have an Australian judge, born Australian, who's married to the leader of the opposition, who the pro-PRC government is trying to get kicked out of the country. So you're seeing that subversion of the judiciary happening already. And it's the Chinese, they're very helpful because by what they attack, they tell you what you need to reinforce. So what are they scared of? They're scared of an independent judiciary. They're scared of a free press. They're scared of elections that actually represent the will of the people. So
I'm thinking Hong Kong.
Me too,
Yeah.
actually. I was just thinking this is everything they attacked in Hong Kong.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what should be supported on this political warfare battlefield? All of those things. And unless you do that, they're leading towards an environment where countries don't have sovereignty, freedom of action. You can see it, like you said, you can see it in Hong Kong, but you can see it in Latin America. You can see it. The pattern is extremely consistent. And just to go right back to the beginning, you can see it in the United States. This is the reason why the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas example is so important. This is what's happening in CNMI in the United States of America, where you have this co-option through alleged commercial interests creating a situation where the kinetic becomes very difficult, but even governance becomes difficult, where you create essentially a debt dependence that makes you more reliant on the Chinese at a level that is very clear and understandable. So cleaning up the CNMI system in the same way that you've got all of these case studies for how China goes after and entropically disintegrates these other countries from the inside, which is what they're trying to do in CNMI. CNMI, as part of the United States, could be a perfect place for the U.S. to refine the counteroffensive. How do you get those parasitic levers that are leeching off the system and at the same time weakening to the point of death the internal systems? How do you extract that? So I would argue that helping the governor of CNMI and their team decorrupt and deparasite their territory from Chinese influence and control is a good place to start figuring out what to do when you start to see this increasingly. You already do to a certain extent, but where you see it more and more within the U.S., the rest of the U.S. itself.
So they need some kind of political ivermectin to deworm it.
Yeah, oh yes, deworm it. Yes, I wouldn't say it's antiviral, but yes, for deworming
For deworming it.
Yeah.
Yes.
We need to stay on all platforms, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
It wasn't even a political comment. My sister-in-law uses it to deworm her horses. That's what it's for.
There is nothing you can say that is not political these days.
That's true. Well, I mean, we do this show, so this is by nature a political show.
I don't know.
Isn't
I
it?
feel like our last podcast about Jesus Christ Superstar came pretty close to not being political.
So I would say that also what you need is a political warfare rapid response team. When you've got these openings of kind of honest people who are trying to defend their systems, ways to support them. And that is exactly what China Uncensored and China Unscripted did in the case of Daniel Soudani. You had a crisis situation where the people could support in this very small window a big blossoming of information and understanding about what was going on if you acted fast and in the right way, which you did. So thank you to the team and to all the viewers for showing the way. And now, once you all enter into the U.S. government and show the U.S. government how to do it, we can scale it and expand it and win this war.
I like that. That's a good way to end. Thank you again for joining us, Cleo. I'm sure we'll have you on in like a couple weeks.
We still have the rest of the Pacific to cover. By the way, the South Pacific is just below the equator. So we still have all of the ones above the equator, the Central Pacific, the Western Pacific, all that stuff. We
were going to talk about YAP, but I guess that'll have to be a teaser for our next episode with you.
I mean, do we want to? We could.
No,
it's long.
I think we're already an hour and a half in, so let's wrap it up.
All right, we'll be yapping at you next time. I hope that wasn't a racial slur. Thank you, Cleo.
Always a pleasure. Good to see you, Dan. Thanks.
Well, I actually feel pretty hopeful after that. I mean, compared to most of our podcasts.
Yeah, I feel like there are definitely things that can be done on all levels, like from individual Americans to governments around the world. There are things that can be done. It's just a question of, is there the will to get it done?
Right. And there's also things that people watching can do.
If there's the will to get it done.
That's right.
That'll be my presidential slogan.
Wait,
Something
are you
like that.
running for president?
I'm keeping notes from everything Cleo says. Like, if I were in charge, I would do this. I would do that.
Like if you were elected supreme leader of these United States.
The last vote you'd ever need.
Yes.
The last vote you'll ever get.
I believe that's also the CCP's slogan in the Solomon Islands.
Yeah. You can
Oh, God.
vote communism in, but you can't vote it out.
Yeah. What is interesting to me that it does sound like there needs to be people coming into government from different backgrounds and in different ways, right?
Yeah.
Like it can't just all be people who got their master's degree at the Harvard School of Government and, like are filtered in through specific institutions or
Think tanks
who have a specific, who are like part of the engagement school, for
Right. Like
example.
you need people
Yeah.
from Guam, for example, who grew up in like a totally different environment and can bring some of that wisdom.
Yeah, who are Americans, right?
Yeah, it actually reminded me of, Matt, your dad had some proposal, right, for having like ordinary people serve in the California Assembly.
Oh, he wrote a this was, I forget what media published it, but he had written some kind of op-ed suggesting that the lower house of the state legislature should be not elected but randomly selected among adults, and the reason for that was that you wouldn't have the kind of power plays. And his view was that, like, if you do this and the body is sufficiently large, you would automatically get people who represent the public and people who ask questions like, well, what about, disabled people, or what about like weirdos or whatever. But like the point is to get representatives who come from all walks of life and have had all different experiences, rich, poor, black, white, everybody's going to be in there over time on average. And they will do a good job of representing people, even if they're not necessarily the most intelligent people, because instead of getting these like, on a lot of people who run, and not everybody are these kind of like driven A-type personalities who want power.
Or I think it's like to mitigate against the idea of like career politicians. Right.
Well, and that's part of it too.
Yeah.
But like, yeah, so you don't, instead of having that, you have people who are like, okay, well, I'm called to service. I'm going to serve the way that many people say serve for, one tour or two tours in the military or something. And they're like, they go back to civilian life and they've done their duty. Anyway, that obviously
it's not what it's like, but
it's not what it's like. And also, in order for that to have ever happened, you would have to have the state legislature vote to give up their power. So, whatever. But you brought it up, Shelley. So,
well, no, I mean, I just think it's an interesting idea that is almost replicatable in the sense of if you have people coming in to be congressional staffers, for example, from all, like, because a lot of times what the congressperson cares about can be very influenced by their staff, right? Because they're the ones doing the on the ground work. So if, a congressional staffer comes in, like, who really is like, hey, we really need to, protect the U.S., our relationships with these countries or these U.S. territories in the Pacific, then, like, that could be an issue that eventually the congressperson takes up. Or, if you have people come into the State Department or something with these, like, I think that's, like, in a way, it's like the curse of the bureaucracy, right? But is there a way to kind of like turn that to actually be helpful towards the fight against the CCP?
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. It speaks to the need for more diversity in that field. But when I say diversity, I don't mean like racially diverse people who all graduated from Ivy League schools. Like, I mean,
actual
diversity
of
of life experience, diversity of thought. There's a lot more politics than just Republican and Democrat. There's people who've experienced totally different worlds.
And you were talking about the legislature idea. It was kind of like almost like a jury selection thing, right? Where you'd come in and serve, and the whole thing about like, well, most people are idiots or whatever. Why would you want like, the average person?
The people in charge are idiots.
Well, you know what? I think actually the idea of a jury is one of the best things about the American legal system. I was actually going to
bring up that show, Jury Duty.
Oh.
Did you guys see this? I think you saw it, right?
Saw it.
So it's a reality show that broadcasted last year on Freevee, I think. It was Amazon Prime. as free TV thing, but like they essentially set up a jury duty but like everybody in this case was an actor except for one guy who was like just an average person who really thought that he had been selected for jury duty.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a civil court case in a California court. They like made up the whole thing and like they filmed everything, but it was all weird. It was almost like a psychological experiment about what would happen if
Sounds very unethical.
just this one, like everything is made up except for this one guy who is like proceeding because he doesn't know that whole thing is fake.
Yeah.
And it was actually very uplifting. Like it became a hit because this guy was just like a really good guy.
Yeah.
And like no matter how weird things got around him, he was like just like a very genuine person who tried to do his best.
Interesting.
Well, and I want to speak to the larger point about juries and why it's so important, which is that in a system where there are no juries, then the decisions are made by judges, and sometimes they're elected and sometimes appointed. But like that system can be corrupted. But a jury where it's randomly selected among your group of peers is extremely difficult to corrupt. And more important, you don't need the jury people, the jurors to be smart. You just need them to be good. Right? And so you're actually relying on people's hearts, the human heart, for the legal system. And I think that's actually brilliant because it speaks to what I personally believe, which is that most people tend towards goodness and they try to be good. And in particular, if you have something that's not impacting them publicly, that's not impacting them personally, then it's a little easier as well. So people try to be good. People have goodness in their hearts, and you speak to that and you collectivize that. And then you isolate that from all of the politics that could surround the judiciary if things get corrupt. And, I don't think you always get perfect decisions from a jury, but I think overall the system is definitely the least bad way to do it. I think it is not perfect, but it's optimal. And, the more you can get that idea of bringing people to have people become part of the decision-making process where there's an opportunity for them to do it from their heart rather than from some kind of, cleverness or that can be potentially influenced. I think that you can do a lot of good there. Was that too optimistic for this show?
Yeah, that was very beautiful, Matt. But people aren't watching for your off the rails tangents about the beauty
goodness
of the human heart and juries. They want to hear about musicals.
That is apparently the feedback that we got from the last episode, is that people do really like both anime and Jesus Christ Superstar.
That Venn diagram is bigger than I thought, which is beautiful. And that's what gives me hope. Not your talk about the goodness of the human heart, whatever. You're definitely the Shunza in this setting, and I'm the Hanfeiza.
All right.
Anyone get that? Leave a comment if you got that. All right, now we've been going on a long time, so if you'll excuse me, I have a lot of research I need to do about the reptilian influence of the ancient Roman Empire. Thank you for watching. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley John.
And I'm Matt Gnesta.
I'll talk to you next time.